who's not her husband, is that child a mamzer? Because she couldn't have an act of intimacy with him. She couldn't marry him because she's married to someone else at the time. So is the issue of that man and this lady adultery? And is this child a mamzer? So Rav Moshe Feinstein was of the opinion, he actually said no. At the time, he actually paskined no. And he said that the act of adultery is an intimate physical sexual conduct, right? And therefore, by definition, this is not an adulteress. And this child is not a mamzer, she said. No, actually, he didn't actually make a call on the mamzerus issue at that time. My apologies. But, however, he said, it's an act of betrayal if you think about it. For a lady to initiate getting pregnant to someone else without her husband's knowledge or without her husband's agreement or permission, if you want to use that word, is an act of betrayal. However, it doesn't demand divorce. It's not something which is an automatic divorce. They have to work this out for themselves. The Satmar Rav, the Eilish, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, went spare when Rav Moshe's psak was paskened. According to him, the act of adultery is defined as the introduction of a third-party sperm into the vagina of a married lady, irrespective of the method of introduction, and so therefore by definition this lady is an adulteress, and therefore by definition this child is a mamzer, and therefore by definition divorce is called for, this child can never get married. It was an incredible controversy. You can remember these are relatively new issues that this was debated at the time, and there was descriptions of Sabna Hasidim ringing on Rav Moshe's, who was at the time, he was probably in his mid-80s, on his doorbell at 4 o'clock in the morning to I wouldn't say debate the issue, but let's say to make their point quite strongly known. The Tzitz Eliezer, who we mentioned before, Eliezer Waldenberg, who was the Rav of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, he actually says the act of introducing a third-party sperm into a married lady is not actually against halacha per se, but it goes against basic norms of normative halachic behavior. So therefore, for example, one of the definitions of Judaism is that we care about yichus, for example. Who are the progenitors? Who's the father? Who's the mother? Where's the next generation coming from? As soon as you allow acts of this type, in other words, a donor sperm to thing, you've destroyed this whole body of Judaism and all that we've held dear for all these generations. And the Jewish ladies and Jewish husbands are known to have been chaste, are known to be modest. Last week's parsha we read about the one lady in the history of the time that the Jews were in Egypt, my apologies, who had a child from anyone other than her husband, and even that was a child of rape. Could you imagine the degree of fidelity? We're talking about slaves. And nonetheless, Jews, yichus counts, the family unit counts, the integrity of history counts. Therefore, Eliezer said, yes, it might not be adultery, technically. It might not be mamzerus, technically. But he forbade donor sperm under those circumstances in order to preserve the family unit. The question is, according to the opinions who said, there are opinions who say, yes, you may use donor sperm because it's not an act of adultery and it's not an act of mamzerus. It's just the procuring of genetic material for someone else. The question is then, let's take that part of the argument. Where should you get that sperm from? Should you get it from a Jew? Or should you get it from a non-Jew? What would be the issues involved here? On the one hand, if you get it from a Jew, then you're leading to potential problems of incestuous problems in the future. For example, that child of a Jewish guy who's not the husband has a direct familial relationship, possibly with other children of the donor. And if they were to ever marry, that would be an act of incest. And that child would now, the next generation would be a mamzerus. Besides the fact that it's an issur d'oraisa, it's against Torah law to have a sexual relationship or to have a child with a close family kin. Right? In addition, what are the problems if you have, however, if you have a non-Jew, you don't have problems with mamzerus because that child is from, almost if you will, I don't want to use a pejorative, but like from foreign sperm, let's call it, you don't have a problem of adultery because the definition of halachic adultery of halacha is that a Jewish guy with a Jewish lady. So therefore, on the face of it, you've got a much better chance halachically if you allow donor sperm to use non-Jewish sperm. However, on the other hand, we know that, and again, I'm not trying to denigrate here, but we know that halacha discusses and Shulchan Aruch discusses and Torah discusses that, for example, the child of a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, although that child is Jewish according to consensus of Torah law, there are minority opinions who say that child is not Jewish and needs to be converted, but the halacha is accepted that that child is Jewish. However, also, and this isn't as well known, that child is described as quite a pejorative word. It's considered a pogrom. It's considered a lower or lacking or impacted by its father. To the extent, for example, a child of a non-Jewish father and a Jewish mother, Jewish though that may be, can't marry a Kohen if she's a girl. So a Kohen, sorry? A Kohen cannot marry a girl whose father is non-Jewish.
What was the descriptor?
Pogum.
Pogum.
Pogum Lukuna. If you want, if I try and remember, it's been a number of years, have a look in Shulchan Aruch, Even Ezer, Simon Zayin, and probably it's like it. Huh? Alright?
He'll check it out in his library.
Okay. That child is halachically Jewish. By the way, interesting enough, I mean, people don't know this also. By the way, if you're mentioning the word Pogum Lukuna, people don't know this also. But, for example, a child of two converts also can't marry a Kohen.
A divorcee can't marry a Kohen. There's all sorts.
Okay, so we've discussed some of the major issues specifically when it comes to donor sperm. Right? When it comes to donor sperm, we've discussed... Well, let's talk about some of the other major issues here, like, for example. So we've talked about should be a Jew, should be a non-Jew. Okay? We've discussed whether it's grounds for divorce if the wife did it without the husband's knowledge, without the husband's permission. Okay? What happens if a husband gives permission? Yeah, so you know what, we can use donor sperm. I have no problem with it. I need a child, you need a child. And I've got to tell you the truth, although most of the halachic authorities discuss Peruv, have you fulfilled the mitzvah when you do this act? Have you fulfilled the mitzvah of having a child? Whenever you speak to a couple, no couple's ever asked, am I fulfilling the mitzvah? People just want kids. People just want kids. So, let's say a husband gives permission to his wife to use donor sperm. They do an IVF. Okay, question. Can he then say, no, I changed my mind? Can he say, yeah, we're going through, and then the day before it's like, I really don't want you to get pregnant from anyone who's not me. I don't want to have a child produced who's not my child. I'm backing out of this. These are discussions. Has his initial consent, he doesn't have to give consent originally, because that's a familial relationship. But is his initial consent thereby giving her the right to have kids? And this hinges on very, very esoteric discussions about what is a woman's rights in the marriage. For example, when a lady says, look, you can't get me pregnant, does she have the right to demand a divorce? Does she have the right to demand, right? And these cuts both ways, man, women as well. We can't get involved in that nowadays. But let's say the embryo has already been produced. She's got an embryo in a petri dish, which is her genetic material, which is from a donor sperm, and he says, look, I really don't want you to implant that. I don't want you to transfer it. Does he then have the right to withdraw permission? And these are some of the really issues. And these let's be honest, nowadays, most of these arguments are threshed out before they get there. They put down the money to get to the IVF lab. But they have a lot of things. For example, what is one's legal responsibilities when one gives a commitment to another person, to your own spouse? You can't break a contract without having, or you can't break a verbal contract. If you and I agree to go into partnership and then I say, no, that's pulling out of this. What is that the same thing when it comes to a familial relationship? Do you have that same spousal relationship? Fascinating, huh? Okay, now, when it comes to discussion about who's the father, if the husband, but not the genetic father of this child, is this his child? No. Well, I don't know, because halachically, for example, if a Jewish lady gets pregnant, even if she slept around, disregarding the ability to prove it by DNA, and let's assume for the moment DNA doesn't count for anything in halacha, who's the assumed husband? Who's the assumed father? The husband. Right? There's an assumption in Gemara Roiv Bila Seitzabal that a lady might have had an affair, might have had a relationship with someone else, but her primary source of sexual connection is her husband, and therefore, by definition, the father is the child. The husband is the father. Would that be true when we introduce artificial reproductive techniques? Does he have, for example, does this child have rights of inheritance?
What about the obligation of kibbud avayim?
Does he have? Thank you. Does he have a responsibility to demonstrate respect to his father, who's not his genetic father? Right? What about if the two sons, one of whom is a son who's of donor sperm? What's his relationship with another son? They might have the same mother, but do they have the same father? If one of them dies, does the other one have to fulfill the act of yibum or chalitza because someone who died without having kids? If that's too deep, if that's too esoteric, let's talk about other things. How do we prevent this concept of incest if we don't know? Until now, it's always been assumed that there's a familial relationship between a husband and a wife and the child is theirs. But as you pointed out now, can you assume that anymore? Can you assume that? And so, and by the way, do you have to have a responsibility nowadays? I mean, till relatively recently, all the IVF doctors were telling their clients, "Shh, don't need to tell the kid. You're the father. You're the mother. Go home. Enjoy yourself. It's your child." Is that what halacha would suggest? What about telling that child's future spouse that, by the way, this is my father, not my father? What happens if the father's a Kohen, but the donor is not a Kohen or a non-Jew? This is a child of a Kohen who everybody knows, but he can't duchen, or maybe he does duchen. Huh? So these are huge minefields, which even according to the people who say that you can do donor sperm, they have to be worked out with and developed and dealt with. What about extracting sperm post-mortem? Can you become a father after you've died? It happened here in Melbourne. There was a gangster mole, some lawyer's wife. She wanted to get sperm out of her dead gangster. Huh? She went to court. They took the sperm out first because you've only got about a 6 or 7 hour window of opportunity. So they extracted it, and then she went to court for the right to get pregnant with that. What happens if a couple have? Huh?
Look, there's a organisation in Israel that does that for the IDF now. So for the soldiers in IDF,
they do
bank for
But they give their
potentially.
consent, don't they?
No, it's all about consent.
What they'll do is they'll get before they go off on
They'll
a
freeze.
scary mission. They'll actually in case they ever want to have kids in the future. I'm dealing with quite often. People are calling me and say, look, my son's about to go through chemo. Can we freeze sperm in advance? Or my daughter is about to go through chemo. Can we freeze some ovarian tissue, or can we freeze eggs? So there's a discussion. According to halacha, can you freeze sperm? Even according to the opinions who say you're allowed to ejaculate you're allowed to masturbate in order to acquire sperm, in order to be able to do an act of so-called regular IVF. That's when there's a clear and present need that the husband wants to get his wife pregnant with his own sperm. What happens if the guy's not married yet? He's a 16-year-old yeshiva boy. He doesn't yet have a mitzvah to have kids. But if you don't,
you can get sperm in other ways.
You can do testicular biopsy, which has its own problems. It's a general anaesthetic, and also this question is does that consider the child? Does that enter the new designation, what's known as krushivcha or pseudodaka, which is the punctured help me out here. Testicle, crushed testicle. You can also do electroejaculation, but that's really not practiced here in Australia. It's done in America. It's done in Israel.
It is practiced.
It is?
in Australia.
Oh, okay, well, I'm glad to hear that because I was, I've dealt with cases of boys doing it, and the doctors here, that wasn't even part of their repertoire. So I'm glad to hear that's now possible. But anyway, leave that alone for now. So, let's move now. How are we doing for time? Let's move now into egg donation. If you notice on your form, I've actually called it egg donation and gestational surrogacy. Why did I put them both in the same thing? Egg donation is when a lady can't get pregnant, either because she doesn't have ovarian reserve or because she's too old or her eggs don't work, and so therefore she gets an egg from someone else. She gets an egg donation from, in America you can go pay $20,000 and get hold of from a US college student, and they've got this with banks and stuff like that, and you can get yourself, well actually not really banks because eggs really don't freeze very well. They're doing it and they're finding some degree of success. 5 years ago they were just doing it to make money. Nowadays there have been children born, but eggs really don't freeze very well compared to embryos. Right? But let's say an egg donation. So people come to me and say, this isn't my egg, but nonetheless, I'm going to nurture it, I'm going to carry it, I'm going to get pregnant, I'm going to deliver this baby, it's going to be my baby. The question is, who's the mother? What's the definition of maternity in Judaism? Is it biology, or is it the nurturing of the birth, or is it both, or is it neither? Do you need to have both? You have to be your genetic material and you bringing it to term in order for the piece of your child. And for people coming to me, why are the rabbis making it so difficult? If a lady brings a child to term and it's her baby, then it's her child. You say, that's fine, okay, makes sense. Okay, it makes sense what you're saying is. But let's take a step to surrogacy, which is the exact opposite, where a lady has eggs, but she can't get pregnant, or she can't carry or can't deliver. And what they do is they impregnate those eggs, hopefully with her husband's sperm, and then they put that into a surrogate mother who's the womb for hire, and then that child is delivered. If you're going to say that the egg donor has no relationship, it's just the mother who brings it to term, then by definition, surely you have to say that's a surrogate mother who's the mother. I mean, by Australian law, they say, if you're the egg donor, and the person uses your eggs but has the baby, okay, she's the mother. And the surrogate, if you take the baby and you bring it up as you're the mother. We'll call everybody mother. You can even have your name on the birth certificate. But that's worrying about people's feelings. I'm not discounting worrying about people's feelings, but you have to be some degree of consistency. Surely halacha says if it's the egg which defines maternity, then you have to be consistent even in the case of surrogacy as well. So, until relatively recent, and this is a fight which is still going on, and everybody's got an opinion, and people are fighting about this and crazy. Who is the mother? Is it the donor? Is it the lady who gets pregnant or carries it to term? And is it gestational or is it maternal? What is the definition of maternity? And I've got to tell you, there's no clear answer to this. You will find great rabbis who believe it's gestational. You will find great, incredibly knowledgeable rabbis who believe it's maternal. Some who believe it's both. Some who believe it's neither. So therefore, the consensus of opinion is what we do nowadays is both in cases of surrogacy and in cases of egg donor, we will do what's known as a giyur misafek. We will do a conversion based on, because we don't know. We don't know, therefore this child is converted. Okay?
And if it's adopted?
It's really tough, because the question is, we don't call it a pure giyur, we call it giyur misafek, a non-known giyur. It might be a lower level. It might be a lower level of. Yeah. Huh?
It's like a double negative.
Yeah. It might be a lower level of. We set the bar a bit lower. Let's say, for example, when someone adopts, we basically we insist that you adopt a fully frum lifestyle, just like any other conversion. Possibly the Beis Din will set the bar subtly lower when it comes to a giyur misafek. But again, I'm not going to speak for the Beis Din. It depends on the Beis Din in each town what they accept as the halacha. I don't have time to discuss whether a husband can retract permission after the embryos and thing, or this is actually a case that happened in Israel. A couple procured embryos and they were about to implant them into a surrogate when their relationship broke down. And by the way, one of the biggest destroyers of relationships is infertility. It's hell on relationships, right? It's not just the money; it's the roller coaster. It's the blame. It's really that's what the counselling is there for. But the question is, she wanted to continue with the surrogacy, and he says, "Well, I've found myself a new partner, and I've got kids already. I don't need I'm not paying child support for a child I don't want, and so wasn't actually decided by the rabbis. It was decided by the Israeli courts. But the halacha actually, I've read a couple of tshuvas here about what would halacha say in that case. There are other ethical issues. For example, even if you allow surrogacy, for example, can a surrogate be paid? In Australian civil law, no, you can't. Would halacha say you can't pay someone? In America, you can pay for. Like I told you, America's a wild west when it comes to you do whatever you want. Halacha probably wouldn't have a problem with paying someone. You know, she's after rendering a service, right? It's more of a moral issue. For example, you know, the exploitation of the poor more than it is of a halachic issue.
It assumes that the surrogate is not aware and doesn't have full capacity of what she's doing.
Running the place to get surrogacies nowadays. If you're an Australian wants a surrogate, don't get it in Australia because it has to be an altruistic donation from a lady who's already had kids and all this.
I want to do it for my sister.
What?
What if I want to do it for my sister?
So that for sisters is more than a moral issue. That actually becomes a halachic issue because then we have familial relationships going on here, potential mamzeris issues as well. So also by Australian law, you have to have had a child already. But halachi, you're actually far better off getting a surrogate who hasn't had a child, right? She's also, and not married, right? Which is almost impossible. It's almost impossible.
Where do you go for surrogacy now?
What do people do? I'm not sending you there, but what do people do? They go to America and they pay $90,000, I think, or they go to India and they pay 15 or 20.
Or they go to Thailand.
Thailand, isn't it? Okay, yeah.
Dollars?
More than $20,000. And I think the surrogate mother only gets about 10 or 15 of that.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
she gets more.
Well, here's the moral issue here. For example, what type of contract?
She gets more.
By Australian civil law, do you know that the surrogate can back out at any time? By Australian law, the surrogate who's doing that, it has to be altruistic. She can say, as she's having the baby, with not her genetic material. And by the way, there's two types of surrogacy. There's partial surrogacy, which is when you use the husband's sperm, put it into the surrogate mother, but her own eggs. And then there's full surrogacy, which is the only one which is legal in Australia. If I understand correctly the act, I skimmed through it again today. The partial surrogacy is not legal in Australia, my understanding is. But leaving that aside, the question is, can a surrogate back out? And according to Australian civil law, she absolutely can. She can just say, I'm not giving over the baby. I've had this baby for the last 9 months. I'm not giving it over. Can a surrogate back out? If the mother's taken. When can she back out? According to Australian law, she can back out at any time. In American law, where it's a contract, contracts can be enforced. What would halacha view that contract?
But again, and I can talk from experience, in America, if you go to a reputable organisation, they make sure that the surrogates are fully counselled and have advisors and have backup.
But by American law,
coerced.
okay, here's the question. Let's say the mother gets into, the child's in fetal distress, and the surrogate, the parents who are going to be the surrogate parents, not the parents, what they call the commissioning parents.
The intended parents.
The commission, that's the word they use, the commissioning parents. They insist that the surrogate undergo a C-section. And
that's set out
it's all set up in writing, because in America it's contract law. They're not discussing it from a fertility issue. They're discussing it from contract. Whereas in Australia, that contract is not a contract because it's altruistic. What would halacha have to say about those? What about the age of commissioning parents?
A personal relationship and discussions going on. It's not just this is what the document says.
No, you're right. Which is why in America I'm saying it's more expensive. But for example, there's probably less of the concept of exploitation. Whereas if you read some of the descriptions of what's happening in India and Thailand, that the word exploitation is a very, very scary word. But it seems like that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
I mean, God forbid, that Australia's just cleaned up the concept of puppy farms, but Ovarian tissue donation is actually a new one, which is just coming in. So far, from my understanding, from my reading, it's only really worked so far from identical twins. But there's the potential in the future that they might be able to transplant ovarian tissue from one lady into another lady, thereby giving the second lady a new lease on life and new ability to ovarian reserve. Now, you might say to yourself, what's the difference in that and egg donation? Well, the difference might be it actually becomes part of you. It actually becomes your tissue. In some ways, if you get a heart transplant, that's your heart. It becomes part of you. It's pulsing with you, and it becomes who you are. The discussion. I was only reading today some really, really fascinating, trying to make some relevancies between that and halachic things about orla and planting and grafting and the like. But
uterus. which is uterus transplants as well. Today's
Yes.
big discussion.
Just
Like in
that.
Sweden, I think, is the
Yes,
big.
it's-
I think the
With
fourth time
there was a really elegant solution someone came up about when you're doing the surrogate from a married lady, and by like I told you, halachically, you're far better off using a unmarried lady, although Australian civil law says an unmarried lady, right? Australian civil law questions about that, but if you're using a married lady with all the potential problems of mamzeus we've discussed till now, and all the potential problems of adultery which we discussed when we were talking about sperm donation, there's a very elegant halachic solution. Someone said, let's the lady who's agreed to be the surrogate, let her divorce her husband for that short time while she's impregnated, right? While she's impregnated, right? So therefore, it's not an act, right? And then get remarried, right? But the only problem is, by law, halachically, you're not allowed to. There's something called havchana. A pregnant lady is not allowed to get married for 24 months, except of course to the father of the child. But you can't marry someone who's pregnant from someone else. Can't marry because it's considered by law, by halacha, to impact on the rights of the unborn child. That she'll be starting a new relationship. So the question is, if she gets pregnant and then remarries her own husband, is that impact on that 24 months called Achana? So like I said, these are new issues. These are something we've only been talking about these for 15, 20 years, which in the greater scheme of things is tiny. You could stop me. I've got stuff on an unmarried lady getting pregnant.
Let's conclude with that.